So you're planning to buy real estate, which I really think is one of the best investment decisions you can do. But the question is, are you buying a house or an apartment? My name is Kai. Let's talk about it. Obviously, there are pros and cons for each of them. Ultimately, it's your personal decision. And of course, the question, are you buying it to live in it yourself, or are you buying it out of investment reasons? Because those two things can really have a big impact as to what decisions you'll make. I'm going to run you through a couple of decisions to consider when making your choice as to which one you're going to be buying. Owning apartments myself, I'm definitely biased towards apartments. At the same time, definitely one day I'll be adding also a house to my portfolio, because I do believe as I get older, I definitely value having a garden, more space, privacy, and of course being away from the hustle and bustle of the city life. Right, with this, let's kick off the comparison looking at the ownership type. Now, the biggest differentiation here is freehold versus leasehold. That may differ from countries to countries, but usually it is the same principle for many places around the world. A freehold basically means that you are the sole owner of the property, but also the land. More importantly, the land where the property stands on. If you buy a house, usually that is a freehold, meaning you are the landlord and you can stay there forever and inherit it for future generations of your family, etc. And that's really powerful. And I think that's one of the biggest advantages of owning a house. There isn't really a con to it because, you can do whatever you want to do with that piece of land. That's great. Versus when you're buying an apartment, usually most of the times you're buying a leasehold. That can be up to 100 years. A lot of the new developments, when you buy them, they have a 100-year leasehold. That sounds amazing. Most likely you're not going to be living there for another 100 years in that apartment. But it is something to consider later on down the line when you want to inherit it to somebody else, or a resale value. Let's say you buy an already built apartment that already has, let's say, 50 years on the leasehold, and that will definitely lower the value. So with every year less, the value of that apartment definitely diminishes because, obviously, eventually when the lease is up, it will technically go back into the freehold owner of that land, which in some cases can be the developer, in other cases can be the municipality or the government that owns the plot of land. And basically that building goes back into their belonging and you will be stripped of your rights of that place because they own the entire land where the apartment is on, and then later on they could decide what to do with it. So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, some apartments also have freehold. That's amazing. If you can find a freehold apartment, I really recommend you to go for that because, as I said, you don't want to be in a situation where your leasehold expires and then, you don't know what to do. Obviously, the value goes down. So I think there are a lot of benefits in having a freehold piece of land that you really physically own. In terms of investments, I think it's really difficult to project because it really depends on the market where you're in the neighborhood where you're buying. Some neighborhoods go up, some go down. So an apartment can go up in value, a house can go up in value, but also vice versa, it can drop. If the neighborhood goes down, things happen, etc. So in general, houses and apartments tend to go up in value over time, as does the rent. So I think in pure investment terms, it's really difficult to compare. So it's really hard for me to make general statements. Overall, I think investing in real estate is a good investment because it has stood the test of time, that the values of those assets go up over time, as does the rent. So of course, one thing, it is easier probably to rent out an apartment than a house because, houses are not that popular, at least in Europe, to rent. Most people buy them, so they end up renting more apartments. If you buy a real estate for investment purposes, then definitely an apartment can be more liquid, that you can quickly rent it out rather than a house, which also, even if you plan to sell it one day, it's just less liquid because usually those things take longer than an apartment. So that's just something to keep in mind. In terms of cost, it also really depends on the market where you're in. In most places, a house generally more expensive than an apartment. At the same time, of course, if you compare by square meter, generally then the house would be cheaper because you also get more space for the amount that you're paying. So the total amount you pay might be more expensive with the house, but obviously you also get much more space, a garden, a freehold, all these other benefits that you don't usually get with the apartment. If that apartment is smack down in city center, of course the price will then be also significantly higher than for a house in a less desirable suburb somewhere outside the city center. In my case, where I live in Lithuania, actually houses are generally cheaper than apartments because the space in city center is so small. We have a beautiful old town here, so the apartments are significantly more expensive than a house, which is really quite interesting. In Germany, where I'm originally from, it's quite the opposite. So again, it depends on the market where you're in, but generally an apartment is cheaper. At the same time though, you might have higher ongoing costs for your apartment. And that's when we talk about maintenance. So in the house, obviously you have full control over the maintenance cost. Now, clearly things will break down in the house and that's normal, but you have control of which contractor you'll get, how much you're going to pay for them, etc. You might even fix it yourself if you want to. So that will definitely help in terms of budgeting. You can better project the costs and you have full responsibility of all the costs. In an apartment though, you obviously share that building with many other people. Usually you have an owners association, or the developer of the apartment kind of manages this building to have a management company. And if something happens to, let's say, the lift, right, that affects everybody. And then everybody has to chip in. The management company will get a proposal and then split usually the costs across all the different tenants. And you don't have any control over it. If they end up hiring the most expensive company to fix the lift, you will pay the price for it. It's not exactly that you can fix it yourself, right? That sometimes, depending on where you live, can get really quite expensive, and it's out of your control in many cases. Also, when we talk about service charge, now obviously when you have your own house, you have your own garden, there aren't any service charges applicable. Unless you live, of course, in a compounded, gated area with other houses, with security system, etc. So they might have small service or communal fees that you have to pay, but usually there aren't any. Versus if you live in an apartment, they can be quite substantial, because usually you have some kind of security system, you have people taking care of the public area, the garbage, cleaning the staircase, the elevators, maintain those things. Sometimes you even have a concierge in some apartments. So these things need to be taken care of, and obviously somebody has to be paid for that. So once again, the developer or the management company of the compound will charge you a monthly fee usually, and that is charged by square meter. So depending on how big your apartment is, that can be, in some places from €1, but I've seen places in Dubai all the way to €10 per month per square meter in fees. So once again, that can start eating into your profitability or your monthly cash outflow if you choose to live there for yourself. As I mentioned before, in terms of ownership duration, if you have your own house and it's a freehold, which in most cases it will be, obviously you can hold it forever, you can inherit it to future generations. Versus an apartment, you can of course have long leases. That's good if you're just starting off with 100 years. That sounds amazing. But still, even if you wanted to pass it on to future generation, eventually they might run into issues and it might default back into the government's hand. So that's something to keep in mind, and something where I'm really conscious of, that I only buy places with a freehold, because I just want to avoid having to calculate, how many years are left and who could take possession of the property one day. So that's just personal preference, but of course, it's up to you. Another thing when it comes to alterations and improvements to your property, of course, if you have your own house, you're free to make any alterations and changes that you want. You usually don't have to ask any landlord or anybody else, because, well, you own the property, right? So that's really nice. In some cases, you might need to get council approval, especially when it comes to your garden work, or you want to cut one of the trees, or maybe you want to add a second story to your building. Sometimes that happens. You start with one floor house and later on you want to add a second floor, and in that case you might need to get council approval for that. But generally you're pretty much free to do a lot of things in your house without asking anyone. Versus in a flat internally, you obviously have a lot of freedom that you can do. But, for example, on the balcony, recently I got an email from my apartment in Dubai. The developer asked us as a landlord to remove any decorations we have on our balconies, as well as asking us to stop doing barbecues on the balcony. So once again, if I bought the apartment imagining myself to make a nice barbecue there every evening, and all of a sudden I'm being told I can't do this anymore, that's something that wouldn't be applicable if I had my own house. But if I buy an apartment, even though I'm the landlord, I still have to play by other people's rules. And for any other alterations, I would need to get the developer's approval usually, plus city council if it's really something structural, etc. So that's also something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of renting, if it's not for yourself, but as an investment property, as I mentioned before, definitely you can rent to whoever you want your house, even though in many cases it's less common to rent a house and less liquid. It will definitely take you much longer to rent it out than with an apartment, which is really easy to rent. The market is very liquid. People move in and out of apartments all the time. When I look to some markets, especially in Germany, Munich, Berlin, there's queues of people wanting to rent apartments, and the owner is almost interviewing the potential tenant to get the best fit for the property. So it's really crazy. Such a saturated market, not enough supply and too much demand. So it makes it very liquid in many destinations around the world. So I think that's a great option as an investment property. Though, of course, one thing to keep in mind, in case you wanted to turn your apartment into a short-term rental through Airbnb or even booking.com, there you would once again need to get the approval from the owners association or the developer or management company, because a lot of places actually forbid you from doing so, and you would need to get specific approval. Plus, of course, you also have the city council coming up with their own regulations. A lot of owners in New York recently were very disappointed when the New York City Council imposed new rules that pretty much made it impossible for those landlords to rent their apartments through Airbnb. So if that was your business model when you bought it in the first place, that can really be a blow to your investment projections, and therefore owning a house, you're much more in control of that process as you have much more freedom and liberty to do whatever you want to do with it. And lastly, if you buy the real estate for yourself to live in, then ultimately it's an emotional decision that you need to make yourself, because nobody can tell you what is right or wrong. An apartment could be better on paper as an investment property, but ultimately if you're going to spend a number of years in there in your precious life, I think you really want to live somewhere where you feel comfortable to live. Don't follow the spreadsheet, instead follow your heart. See where you feel comfortable. Do you need the space? Are you fine with driving half an hour after work to go to your beautiful little green oasis outside the city center? Or do you prefer the hustle and bustle of city life? And honestly, I always thought I wanted the house, and we were almost with my wife very close to buying our house. We went there, and on the way driving there, it took us 35 minutes, and we said, wow, it's just too long, and we'll be missing the beautiful old town where we're living right now. And in the end, we said, no, for the time being, we want to live in the city center, have a beautiful apartment, of course, ideally top floor with a big rooftop, so you still have your privacy and space. But maybe one day in the future that will change. So considering all these things is nice and great, but at the same time, it's the money I worked very hard for, and ultimately I want to live somewhere that I can really enjoy and feel comfortable. So that's something you have to answer yourself. But I think looking at those points, I hope it can help you in making a better decision whether you want to buy a house or an apartment. Either way, I think both are amazing investments, and you can't really go wrong with either of them. Next up, check out this video over here. Stay healthy, get wealthy, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!